Hello, and welcome to Friends Life Care Vigor webinar, The Brain and the Ear, a Two-Way Street. My name is Katie Sorrentino, and I am the Acting Director of Wellness Initiatives. Before we begin our presentation today, I'd like to go over one housekeeping item. You will notice there is not a chat feature box for today's presentation. You may submit questions by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you don't see the Q&A feature on your screen, you can run the cursor over the bottom and you'll see it. We encourage questions throughout and we'll be checking in to answer those questions. I would now like to introduce Dr. Tom Goyne. Dr. Goyne is an audiologist in private practice at Aberdeen Audiology in Wayne, PA. He is a visiting lecturer at Salus University. His primary clinical interests are auditory processing and amplification. Thank you for being here, Dr. Goyne.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you all for attending. So yeah, let's get into it. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Aberdeen Audiology is in Wayne, ABC Hearing is in Westchester. Salus University, I think, is about the second largest or largest audiology program in the country, and we're lucky enough to have it over in Elkins Park near Abington and Jenkintown. And so, you know, I enjoy the teaching side of things and I enjoy the audiology side of things, and today allows me to do both of those things. So thanks for having me. Here's sort of the agenda I sort of put into place today. We're going to talk about the effects of untreated hearing loss on cognitive abilities as we age. It has an effect at all ages, but as we age, it has more of an effect. So we'll get into that a bit. We'll talk about how the brain rewires in, even cases of mild hearing loss. And, spoiler alert, as they say, it's maybe not the best way to rewire things. We will talk about the effects of amplification, in other words, hearing aids, on the brain's wiring. It helps. And then we will talk about, in addition to hearing aids, what are the tools we have at our disposal as audiologists to take things a step further in terms of both hearing and brain health. We're going to be, and there'll be time for question and answers, of course, too. I think what you're going to find is this talk is a bit of a pendulum going back and forth between some bad news and some good news, and eventually we land on good news. And so, the bad news is hearing loss is not good for your brain. The good news is there's lots of stuff we can do about it. So, let's get in here. Over the last 10 years, there's been more and more attention paid to the effects that hearing loss has on the brain. And, this is just a screenshot, a quick Google search, search for hearing loss and cognitive decline, and about 14 million results come back. And this is just to illustrate, how much discussion there is about this. We've known for decades, more than the last 10 years, we've known for 40, 50, 60 years that untreated hearing loss leads to, partial, or more than partial in some cases, social isolation. So in other words, you're less likely to go out to social situations, dinners, restaurants, parties, all things being equal. If you don't hear well, you might decide to stay home. And, a lot of those things lead to mild depression, mild anxiety. The hearing loss can lead to increased mental fatigue because all day long your brain is kind of trying to decipher what it's hearing. You don't realize it's going on because hearing loss is very gradual, so you don't really realize you're putting forth that increased mental effort. But it's going on. And so we've known that for ages, even before I came into the profession, way before I came into the profession, we knew these sort of things. But in the last 10 years, we've really begun to much better understand how much more rapidly a person's brain ages when they have less than normal hearing. And oh, by the way, when we talk about hearing loss, depending upon what research you look at, it's often the third or fourth most common condition in people over the age of 60. In the source I looked at most recently, it's surpassed only by heart disease and diabetes. And so then number 3 for people over 60 is hearing loss. Sometimes you'll see arthritis creep in there, and surpass hearing loss. But suffice it to say, hearing loss is third or fourth. And what really got us noticing this is about 10 years ago, there was a research study done. It was a longitudinal study. Folks at Johns Hopkins did it. Basically, there's a longitudinal study at Johns Hopkins that people in the study are being examined over and over again. My apologies, my doorbell's going off. At any rate, sorry about that. They're being tracked for years, and they're being tracked for all sorts of different things: hearing loss, heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, their mental health, things like that. And so what they found is that people with mild, moderate, and severe hearing loss were twice or 3 times or 5 times as likely to develop dementia. And so that's when we really began to realize, oh, wait a minute, this is a bigger deal than we thought. This is potentially much more serious than, look, that's Uncle Jim, he just doesn't hear well, let's have fun, it's kind of funny. No, this is actually a much more serious thing. A couple years later, we got another study, another longitudinal study that looked at this in a similar way, but found very similar results. And I should say in both of these studies, we're not talking about small groups of people. The first study I talked about was over 600 people. This study, over 1,100 people. So we're not talking small sample sizes. We're talking large groups of people. And they found that the annual rates of decline were 41% and 32% greater, depending upon the degree of hearing loss, than people with normal hearing. So, in other words, if you have hearing loss, your brain is going to age 30 to 40% faster than it would otherwise. Big deal to say the least. Big deal to say the least. And I should say in this particular study, the average age was about 77 and a half. So, I can't see all of you, and I wasn't given your ages ahead of time, but knowing what Friends Life Care, what their mission is, I'm guessing this may hit close to home for a lot of us on this call. Shortly thereafter, another research study. In this study, they looked at, they performed MRIs on people with and without hearing loss as they age. So periodically, every year, they're doing MRIs. And they found that the folks with hearing loss had a significantly greater decrease in brain volume. So, in other words, if you have hearing loss, your brain shrinks. Now, I don't want to make it sound like, if you go, you start out with a brain, the size of a football, and you end up with a brain the size of a golf ball. If you have hearing loss, I'm not saying that. But you could definitely see on these MRIs a reduction in brain volume around the area of the auditory cortex. And, again, the joke I make, with patients all the time is, look, we all need all of the brain cells we can get. We can't go losing any, right? We all need everything we can get. And so then even more recently, we've taken MRIs. I say we, I mean the hearing science community has taken MRIs, and they've done what's called a functional MRI. In other words, monitoring brain activity using an MRI while people are doing certain tasks. And what they have found is that in cases of hearing loss, areas of the brain light up that shouldn't light up in response to visual tasks or auditory tasks. And this is basically because since the auditory real estate isn't being used as much as it should in the brain, other areas of the brain start to take it over. And they call that cross-modal recruitment of temporal auditory cortex is what they call that. But basically it means, again, areas of the brain that would normally be used for hearing start getting used for other stuff because the brain's not using it for sound as much as it should. And again, that's not really how we were designed to work, right? So, you know, while it may be better in some ways than the brain not rewiring, in an ideal world, it wouldn't rewire and the auditory cortex would get used the way it's supposed to be used. So, and this is just a visual example of that. This is a patient where they did a functional MRI. This is before they used hearing aids. So this is hearing loss, but no hearing aid use. And this is a fairly recent study. This was published last year, 2020. And so, the title of my talk, The Ear and the Brain, a Two-Way Street, is it a two-way street or is it a vicious traffic circle? So to recap, what I just spoke about, basically research shows that hearing loss leads to cognitive decline as we age, faster cognitive decline. Unfortunately, as we age, hearing loss or not, cognitive function is declining. But when you have hearing loss, it declines 30 to 40% faster. And then what research also shows is that the cognitive decline that stems from hearing loss makes it harder for the brain to follow speech and conversation in difficult listening situations. Because you need a pretty high degree of cognitive functioning to focus on what the person at the table with you is saying and ignore the 50 or 60 or 70 or 100 other people in the room that are also having their conversation and trying to focus in on the people at their table. So, that isn't something you can do subconsciously. That requires, some high-level cognitive function. And when your brain has declined from hearing loss, it makes it harder to do. So it's like this vicious circle, so to speak. And all of that, in turn, leads to less social interaction because going out and socializing isn't as much fun because you can't follow the conversation as well. And so then that, in turn, leads to greater cognitive decline because you're not socializing as much. So it's a little bit of a vicious traffic circle, as my little image here illustrates. But, staying with the traffic theme and analogy, that's all the bad news, okay? And so, as I alluded to earlier, there is good news. There are definitely things we can do about that. And some of it is sort of natural if you use amplification to address the hearing loss. If you use amplification, the brain sort of unrewires. So it rewired due to the hearing loss, and now it begins to wire back to the way things were intended. And so on the left, you may recognize that image from a few slides ago, and now the image on the right, that's more of how things should look. So now, because of all this attention on hearing loss and the brain, and they're, the two-way street, audiologists have really begun to consider more how we can evaluate the cognitive function of the patients that come through our office or offices. And in the last, year and a half, a FDA-approved cognitive screener has come on the market. I was not part of the development of it whatsoever. I was on an advisory panel that once they developed it, they reached out to a panel of audiologists to find out what their thoughts on it were, and I was part of that. And so it was interesting. I have to admit, though, all of that was being introduced in February of 2020, and then March of 2020 came along. We all know what happened then, and I have to admit, I lost sight of this device, this screener, to a certain extent. But in the last several months, we've come back around to it, and we're really in our office, we're devoting a lot of attention to it, and a lot of audiologists around the country are. This screener, it looks at several different areas of cognitive function, memory, visuospatial processing, executive function, reaction time, processing speed. It's looking at all of those things. And as you can see in the illustration there, green is good, yellow, time to be on the lookout, red, not good. It's kind of nice to give you the, sticking with the traffic theme, it's nice to give you the green, yellow, red warning signs. And so you may say, well, wait a minute, you're an audiologist, not a neurologist. Why are you taking a look at these things? Well, by better understanding somebody's cognitive function, it helps us predict who's going to struggle with amplification, both in terms of adapting to the new sound, but also just in terms of managing and using the devices. And so it kind of helps us be on guard a little bit and make sure we devote maybe extra attention to somebody who may have some difficulties in these areas. It helps us predict who's going to struggle in difficult listening situations. And again, who we may have to adjust the hearing aid a bit differently, or coach them how to use the hearing aid a little bit differently if we know that ahead of time. And then it also allows us to measure cognitive changes over time. So we get this baseline when you're in our office for the first time, and then as you use hearing aids over time, we can retake this test and we compare it to the first day. It also allows us, if need be, to make referrals back to somebody's primary care physician or to a neurologist. If we see somebody's, entirely in the red, we might do something like that. I have a colleague down in Austin, Texas. Her name is Dr. Jill Davis at Victory Hearing Center, and she's used the screener for quite a long time. Informally, this is not peer-reviewed, it's just something she's done within her office. But informally, her data shows that after 60 days of hearing aid use for previously unamplified patients, so people who didn't use hearing aids but had hearing loss, came in, got hearing aids, were successfully fit, their scores after 60 days improved on the cognitive screener. And her and I are exchanging messages about possibly doing something a little bit more of a controlled study over a longer period of time to really track what happens after somebody uses it for a year, what happens when somebody uses hearing aids for 6 months, what are the changes. But you may say, okay, well, all this is great, but I certainly know people who have used hearing aids for a while and they went to a great audiologist and they don't seem to be doing as well as they would like. So why is that? There's a couple reasons for that. I have to admit, one could be user error. In other words, sometimes, patients struggle to use their hearing aids appropriately sometimes. So that could be a little bit part of it. But assuming that's not part of it, there are two primary reasons we look at. One is the brain. Perhaps before using hearing aids, there was some cognitive decline, and that's preventing them from doing as well as they would like in difficult listening situations. I always use restaurants as an example. If we were doing this talk in person, in a room, all of us together, many of you would probably be socializing before and after it started. There'd be a lot of crosstalk. That would be another situation where, not exactly sitting up on a T, easy to understand. And so, it could be that, while the brain may have returned to its original wiring, it may not have done it as well as we would have liked. So that's part of it. The other part of it, and I'm going to get into this a bit because this is really important that people overlook, is the ear is also part of it, though. The ear is still an impaired organ, and so I'm going to explain that here a bit. This is a picture, a microscopic picture of the inside of an inner ear. And all of those little white spikes, you might say, are sensory cells. So those are sensory cells inside the inner ear, and that's where a lot of the business happens. That's where sound is converted from sound into neural activity and then sent on up to the brain, okay? So think of this as like a transformer. It's taking sound and transforming it into an electrical signal to send up to the brain. And so each one of those sensory cells is actually tuned to a different frequency. And the analogy I use all the time is imagine those sensory cells as being like a piano keyboard, okay? And so as each one gets depressed, so to speak, it plays a tone. You can almost think of it that way. Now, I've taken a similar image, that's on the left, and then on the right is an ear with hearing loss. And you can clearly see that those sensory cells on the right do not look like the sensory cells on the left. Some of them are atrophied, some of them are just plain missing. And so, sticking with the piano analogy, imagine if some of the keys on the keyboard didn't work or were missing. And I'm illustrating that with the keyboard there and those high-level graphics, those red X's that I put on there. Imagine if those keys were missing, right? So the issue we still have with hearing aids is we're taking all of this great, wonderfully processed sound that we can do now in the year 2020. Today's hearing aids are great. But we're still delivering all of that great sound to an impaired organ. And so to follow through, even more, imagine, even the world's greatest pianist, if, 1/3 of the keys available to his right hand didn't work, or he or she, they wouldn't be able to play nearly as well, right? Now, people listening would kind of be able to follow along. They might recognize the songs kind of, but not exactly, right? And so that's what goes on with cases of hearing loss, where yes, the hearing aids help. I mean, they're at least making those sounds audible that would otherwise be inaudible, and so that certainly helps. But it's still delivering things to an impaired organ, and so that's another reason why sometimes when people have hearing aids, they don't do as well as they would like. And they will say, often patients will say, "Oh gosh, I hear so much better with my hearing aids." But it's not the same as normal hearing. And this is why they say that. This is one of the reasons why they say that. So, but again, that's bad news. Now we're going to make a turn to good news. We have what's called auditory training, and you can think of that as the proverbial cavalry coming over the hill. Auditory training are listening exercises that strengthen the brain's ability to discriminate phonemes. There's forms of auditory training that can be done on your own, and there's types that can be done in conjunction with an audiologist. In our office, we are definitely finding that people are far more successful with auditory training when it's done in conjunction with us. The analogy I use there is, you may decide you're going to get up super early to exercise one day. If you're going to do it by yourself, there's a decent chance you might not get up early to exercise. But if you have the same plan to get up early and exercise, but you're going to meet a friend there, you've made a deal. There's almost 100% chance you're going to show up and do that exercise, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons why people do better when they're doing it with us as opposed to doing it on their own. Also, though, we're able to tailor the program and things like that and adjust it so that it's a little bit more suited to each patient. But that's one of the reasons why we really, every few years in my practice, I would offer auditory training, but it's self-directed by the patient, and we never got a lot of momentum with it. And now that we're doing it one-on-one with us and we're guiding patients through it, the uptake and success rate is much, much better. You may ask, well, why is this auditory training working? Well, basically, we all learned at a young age through normal ears and normal brain function what the individual sounds of speech sound like. So what a s and a sh, an s and an sh combination, and a th combination sound like. We all learned that through normal ears and normal brain function. But, as we've talked about, some of the keys on the piano in that ear, don't necessarily work as well as they should. There may be some cognitive decline. And so what we're really doing is, with the auditory training, is we're teaching your brain how to process sound through the hearing aid, through the impaired organ, with the brain that you have now as opposed to the brain you had when you were 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old. So the take-home messages. Even mild hearing loss can have a detrimental effect on cognitive function, and so it's important to not ignore it, do something about it. Using hearing aids can help to at least partially restore some of that cognitive function. And then in cases where a person is not getting as much benefit as they would like from amplification, We have auditory training and some other exercises that we can do to help get patients even closer to the finish line to where they would like to be. So I realize I ran through all of that really quickly, threw out a ton of information, and so I'm more than happy to entertain whatever questions somebody has.
We have some questions for you. Okay, the first question, the Tech Enhanced Life Project has been exploring hearables, the overlap of hearing aids with smartphones and Bluetooth earbuds. Are you involved with that?
Can, I'm sorry, can you give me the first word or two of that question again?
It's called the Tech Enhanced Life Project, and it's
I
exploring
have,
hearables.
yeah, I have to admit I haven't heard of that. Generally, though, I'll speak about hearables in general. I don't know too much about that project, although I'm curious to know more about it. But the issue with hearables is that, I mean, I do not want this to sound like I'm trying to protect my turf. The problem, though, is that audiologists are not involved with the treatment of a patient. And so you can have hearing loss for a large number of reasons, some serious, some not serious. And it's important to know before getting into hearing aids or hearables, or over-the-counter hearing aids, whatever you want to call it. It's important to know what's causing the hearing loss before you go down that path. Um, you know, and then also, you know, it's funny if you spend a day in my offices, you'll see, everything we bring to the table in terms of helping people take care of the devices, strategies for helping the devices help them. So just where to position yourself in a room, how to adjust the device, in certain situations, how to take care of them, how to keep them clean, so don't get me wrong. I think hearables, over-the-counter devices, as the years go by, are going to become very important, and people are going to be using them. But um, you just have to be a little bit careful with DIY audiology. In other words, I think because you can walk into a pharmacy and kind of pick up readers and pop them on, and they kind of work. Everyone sort of thinks that that with hearing loss, well, okay, well, we just need to magnify the sound, kind of like with our eyes. We just need to make things a little bit louder, and everything will be good. And that's really not how it works. It's incredibly rare that in my office we're just making stuff louder. There's a lot of sophisticated sound processing we're doing behind the scenes, and it's difficult to achieve a lot of that with hearables. But I'm saying that in the year 2021, but technology marches on, and at some point, somebody's going to develop technology that's going to make it easier for people to do, a little bit of DIY hearing health in a safe way. I hope that answers the question. I am very curious about that project, though. I'd like to know more about it.
We have another one here. This person says they're highly affected in the right ear with high pitches. An example would be in opera, the mezzo and a flute hurt their ear.
Hmm.
Those pitches cause harm.
Boy, every question I miss one or two words. Does what cause harm?
Well, the pitches cause harm. And I have someone else telling me that they're having trouble hearing me too. So I'll adjust. But did you get
Well,
the question?
no, yeah, there's just like a little interruption with every word. Again, it's not you that you need to be louder, just just a little bit of clarity. Um, but I think it's the connection, not you. At any rate, as a general rule of thumb, if sound is painful, it's probably too loud, and you should avoid that situation. Um, that being said, sometimes people's tolerance for loud sounds decreases quite a bit because they're never exposed to the soft and medium versions of that sound. And so then when they hear the loud version of that sound, they're really quite bothered by it. Um, so without seeing a hearing test, it's a little bit hard to say. Again, I would come back to, look, if there's pain, when in doubt, that's not a good situation. But it could be that addressing the hearing loss, if it's not already, addressing the hearing loss, exposing yourself to proper amounts of high frequency sound will sort of develop a healthy callus to somewhat louder, higher pitched sounds when you hear them.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is hearing loss hereditary? Should I expect the likelihood if my father and grandfather experienced it?
Yeah. Good question. We're still trying to sort that out, honestly. There are certainly hearing losses that are hereditary, no doubt about it. And we see those folks where the genetic connection is really strong. We'll see them start to lose their hearing in their 20s. If you're talking more about the age-related type hearing loss, well, my grandfather and my father, they developed hearing loss when they got north of, say, 70. We don't know for a fact. It's kind of hard to know. For one thing, there's a bit less military service now, and life is a little bit quieter. There's less industrial noise, and so it could be that their hearing loss was actually due more to noise exposure than age. And if you're leading a different life with less noise, maybe you won't get it. On the other hand, there's certainly, well, let's put it this way. There are certain health conditions that are genetic that lead to hearing loss, right? So I mentioned earlier, heart disease is very common. Heart disease leads to hearing loss, and diabetes is very common, and diabetes leads to hearing loss. And so it may be that you have a health condition that contributes to hearing loss, and maybe that health condition is genetic. So that kind of plays into it too. But I always say, when in doubt, get your hearing tested, and what's the worst that can happen? You find out you have normal hearing. So, I think for anybody north of 55, an annual hearing test is a good move.
And I do have to say, our attendees seem to have very good hearing because they're commenting on how it's hard to hear me and how there's a little hissing sound in the back for you. So I think that they're really tuned in, and we're sorry that this is coming up, but we're trying to readjust here. So this next question is a two-part question for you, Dr. Goyne.
Okay.
If you have tinnitus, how does that impair hearing if you have hearing aids?
So for one thing, some people say tinnitus, some people say tinnitus. It's tomato, tomato. I tend to say tinnitus. I don't know why, but that's what I say. But at any rate, the research tells us that tinnitus does not really affect your hearing. What's happening is tinnitus is caused by hearing loss, and it's really the hearing loss that is impacting your hearing. I've done it with hundreds of patients. I can measure people's tinnitus. The tinnitus is always, for people who are greatly bothered by it, and for people who aren't bothered by it, and for people who are having good days with it, and people who are having bad days with it. It is always 6 or 7 or 8 decibels louder than the softest sound they can hear at that particular pitch. And so it doesn't really vary in loudness. It's just your perception of it varies, and the degree to which it bothers you varies. And so for some folks it bothers them, which makes it distracting, which then therefore makes it harder to follow speech. But it's been studied left, right, up, and down. Tinnitus is really not very loud. It's just the degree to which you're paying attention to it. And so really the best advice is to get the hearing loss addressed. And I can tell you, the research says, and my experience in my office corroborates this, 85 to 90% of the time, when people have tinnitus and hearing loss, even a mild amount of hearing loss, even a slight amount of hearing loss, when we address the hearing loss, 85 to 90% of the time, the tinnitus becomes much less of a problem, significantly less of a problem.
Now I'm going to call it tinnitus too. The second part of the question is, does tinnitus interfere with hearing using hearing aids?
Right. No. As a matter of fact, the hearing aids are going to help the hearing loss, and that in turn will help the tinnitus.
Right. And one more kind of in line with this, someone else is asking about tinnitus and how you can help with it if you can.
So, again, tinnitus stems from a change to the auditory system. Now, maybe if we test your hearing, we see that there's not enough hearing loss that it's actually causing difficulty understanding speech. In other words, your thresholds are good enough to still understand speech well. all the acoustics of speech are available to you. But it may be a little bit of a hearing loss for you. Your hearing may have been a little bit better. That's where the tinnitus is coming from. So it's tinnitus is your brain trying to compensate for sounds it thinks it should be getting, but it's not. So the great, the analogy I keep coming back to, it's a little graphic, but we've all heard the stories of someone who has lost a limb. They feel itching or pain or tingling where that limb was, and that is the brain compensating for sensations it thinks it should be getting, but it's no longer getting. And tinnitus is the same thing. It's compensating for sensations, in this case sound, it thinks it should be getting, but it's not. And so if you give the brain what it wants, the auditory stimulation that it wants, the tinnitus becomes a whole lot less noticeable and maybe even goes away. And so, an analogy I use is if you're in a brightly lit room and somebody lights a candle, you kind of notice the candle. But that same candle, if the shades are drawn and the lights are turned off and it becomes really dark in there, that same candle now sticks out incredibly. And that's the way tinnitus is. It's really, again, it's not that loud, but when you don't hear the rest of the world in that particular frequency range, it makes the tinnitus a whole lot more noticeable. So there's other things that play into it too. Medications and diet and other health conditions can play into tinnitus a little bit. But tinnitus is caused by, well, assuming it's non-pulsatile. If it goes with your heartbeat, that's a cardiovascular issue. But if it's a steady sound that doesn't go with your heartbeat, then it's due to a change in your hearing.
Thank you. We have an interesting one here, kind of a little bit different. How do you approach convincing a family member who is clearly affected by hearing loss but denies it? Starting a conversation on the topic often ends in arguments, no matter who tries.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question and one I get a lot. And it's tricky, there's no doubt about it. And there is no magic bullet, but that said, I can suggest a few things that will help a little bit. So one is, do not suggest or tell people that they need to go get hearing aids. You cannot do that. That will end badly. What you can suggest, though, is getting a hearing test. Because really it starts with that. You can't, well, you can do weird things on the internet these days, but you shouldn't get hearing aids before having your hearing tested, because you may find out that, hey, it's not even age related. It's just might be a little bit graphic here, but maybe your ears are just clogged with wax. Or it could be that well, maybe the hearing loss is there, but it's not ready for hearing aids yet, or maybe it is. But I've just found that if you launch right into, look, you need to go get hearing aids, that's not going to go well. And the first step is really going and getting a hearing test from an audiologist. In other words, someone with an AUD on the end of their name, Doctor of Audiology. And that's really the first step. But, there's other steps or tips you can try, which are, some of you may remember, I remember the reruns, of I think it was Columbo. He was the detective with the trench coat, and he would always ask questions in a very curious manner. And so you kind of have to do that. You kind of have to ask this particular person in a curious manner, not a sarcastic or accusatory manner. So, I've suggested getting a hearing test. Why don't you want to do it? And depending upon what their answer is, there may be a fairly easy solution to that. Or they may not be able to give you a reason, in which case something's going to click in their mind and they're going to say, oh, I guess I don't really have a reason, do I? I guess I should go do it. Those are some tips. If you wanted to really play hardball, tough love, as they say, stop compensating for the hearing loss. Don't repeat yourself. Don't turn the TV up. Don't be a translator anymore. You might go to a restaurant, waiter or waitress comes up, gives the specials, and then you translate for the person with the hearing loss. If you want to play hardball, don't do that anymore. Just have them figure it out themselves. One of the tough things about this for people, for them to sometimes fully realize they have a problem, is that it's really rare for hearing loss to happen overnight. I mean, it can and it does, But for the vast, vast, vast majority of people, it happens really slowly. And so you kind of don't even really realize that you're losing hearing. The other folks around you realize it sooner, but you don't. The analogy, I use analogies so often, but one I use there is if you've had wallpaper and a picture on the wall, and maybe a picture's on the wall for like 10 years, you decide you're going to do a little redecorating, you take the picture down, and you see how the wallpaper is faded. You didn't know it faded because it was fading ever so slightly, just a little bit, week after week after week over the course of 10 years. Typically, hearing loss is the same way. I mean, when I showed you guys those slides of the sensory cells, the good ear, the bad ear, it's pretty rare that happens overnight. It's usually a very gradual decline. And so sometimes it's hard for people to realize that their hearing has changed when it's a slow decline over time. So there's no magic bullet, but those are some things I've found that help. And you can also tell them that you sat through a webinar with a really handsome, smart audiologist who really appears to know his stuff and is totally harmless and friendly.
I think that is a great answer. And for asking, there will be a recording that you will be sent tomorrow. And you can also watch this on our website. So if you want to share it with someone, we encourage that. And if your loved one is a Friends Life Care member, your care coordinator can also talk with them about hearing loss if you'd like to get them involved. Okay, we have right now 5 more coming in. So
I told you there would be questions, didn't I? I told you.
2 hearing aids, my hearing loss is more significant in one ear. Will this difference cause me cognitive problems?
Um, Assuming you're using hearing aids and your ears are balanced in terms of sound, or maybe one ear is normal and you don't need a hearing aids over there. But as long as you're balancing things out and your brain is pretty much perceiving things as the same loudness in each ear, then you're doing the right thing, and you will be slowing down the cognitive decline. If we could graph yours out, it should be much more similar to the average person rather than the average person with hearing loss.
Next question, does constant wax buildup cause damage to the ear?
It can, but rarely. I mean, every now and then we'll see somebody that's had it in there for a long time, and maybe an infection will develop behind there. That's pretty rare, though. I have to say we don't see it a lot. It's possible, though, and again, that's another reason to see an audiologist. When it comes to DIY hearing healthcare, you can't look in your own ear. I mean, I'm an expert, and I can't look in my own ear. So, that's part of the examination, is having somebody look in your ear and figure out, okay, does everything in there look normal? Is the hardware right? Is everything where it's supposed to be? It's like looking under the hood and seeing, okay, well, I'm not quite sure why this engine is having some issues, but at least all the parts are here, right? But to really answer your question, it's potentially a problem, but we don't see it that often.
Someone is wondering if there is a correlation between hearing and sight.
There are some syndromes that affect both vision and hearing, but not really, other than that. Now, again, with aging comes declined hearing and declined vision, but it's not terribly related. All that being said, though, some of the patients that I've had the hardest time helping are patients who are blind, because when you have hearing loss, even with hearing aids, you need to be ready to listen in order to decipher what's being said. And if you're blind, you don't necessarily know that somebody's approaching you and looking at you and is about to speak to you. And even if you are aware somebody's about to say something to you, you're not able to read lips. And every person on the planet reads lips. Everyone that can see, anyway, reads lips. We learn it as we're learning speech as toddlers, and even younger. Everybody lip reads. They don't know they do. They don't do it consciously, but they do. And so again, with vision issues, it makes lip reading more difficult. Having poorer vision almost makes, well, I shouldn't say almost, it does. It makes hearing loss more difficult. These are great questions, by the way. These are fantastic questions.
We are. Yeah, definitely. We have great attendees today. And a lot of people are also reaching out to tell you, thank you, this is great advice and information. So I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that was coming into along with
Good. Thank you.
How frequently are children misdiagnosed with normal hearing?
Ooh, I don't have statistics for that. I will say, though, that it is less often than it used to be. In most states in the late 90s, early 2000s, most states began to pass laws that required newborn screenings go on in the nursery before children are discharged. Um, and as a matter of fact, anybody who's ever been to my office, I have a picture in my office. I have three daughters. There's all three of them having their hearing screened as infants in the nursery in the hospital. And we can do it actually by reading brain waves, believe it or not. We don't necessarily can tell the quality of the hearing, but we can tell if somebody's hearing well or not. So it does not go undiagnosed nearly as often as it used to. I'm I'm in my late 40s. When I was a kid, and anybody older than me, yes, it definitely happened. But if you were born in the late 90s, it probably didn't get missed, although it could have. What we're also, though, finding, and my office is doing more and more with this kind of work all the time, is that children will have normal hearing, but they will have auditory processing issues. And you can almost think of that as like a learning disability, or almost like dyslexia for hearing, where their hearing is fine, their hearing test, the basic hearing test comes out fine, but their brain doesn't process sound as well as it can or should. And that's been a great population to work with, because we can take some of that same auditory training, use it with them, and they do significantly better. So, sometimes, but a lot of that stuff can be subtle, because, they can hear, but it's more a matter of clarity. And so sometimes that can go miss. That can get missed.
Mm, really interesting. We have someone asking if hypertension is related to hearing loss.
The research says it is. I mean, I have to admit, it's not like there's been mountains of research that's looked at it, but every research study that has looked at it says yes. Basically, when you have any sort of cardiovascular issue, it affects the blood and nutrient and oxygen supply to those microscopic sensory cells that I showed partway through the talk.
Mm.
So, and the longer I practice, the more, sometimes I'm amazed at how resilient those sensory cells are, and sometimes I'm amazed at how fragile they are. And so, anything that interrupts their health can be a problem. And that's why diabetes is a problem. That's why any sort of cardiovascular issue is a problem. To answer your question, yeah, it can be an issue.
The second part of the question here, I think they're asking about hypertension and medications and diet options. So I would say that would you agree, Dr. Goyne, that might be better to speak with your primary or cardiologist about that?
Right. Yeah, oh, exactly. Now, I'll tell you what I tell, sometimes people will ask me the question, okay, I've lost some of my hearing. What can I do to stop from losing more?
Mm.
And, I always say, well, it's part of aging to a certain extent, but if you avoid excessive noise and you keep yourself healthy in general, you're going to lessen the decline of your hearing. It's going to decline at a slower rate. And so, even the side effects of a lot of medications aren't real great for your hearing. And, so again, anything you can do to keep yourself healthy, exercise, eat right, avoid excessive noise, that's going to, lead to better outcomes for your hearing.
We have 9 more questions in 10 minutes, so I think we should be able to get through these at the
Rapid fire round.
What is your opinion on using bone conducting hearing aids instead of traditional ones?
Oh, great question. So, boy, I feel like so many of my answers started out with depends. If your hearing in your outer ear or middle ear is compromised, and basically the outer ear and the middle ear serve to conduct sound to those sensory cells we looked at earlier. So if there's a problem with your outer ear or your middle ear where it can't conduct sound into those sensory cells well enough, then a bone-anchored hearing aid, bone conduction hearing aid, is a great option. It does get tricky, though, sometimes if there's also hearing loss in the inner ear, because then there are limitations to how well or how much sound the bone anchored or bone conduction devices can help. But they're a great option. Um, for folks that have good hearing in one ear, really poor hearing in the other ear, sometimes it's recommended to put a bone conduction device on the poor side and send sound over by bone conduction to the better side. Um, I'm not a great fan of the surgical option of that because there are other non-surgical ways of doing that, both through air conduction and bone conduction and wireless technology. So yeah, that's another question where I have to preface it with depends, but generally speaking, that's my thoughts there.
Wonderful. Someone says, I believe earwax can cause some hearing loss. What is the best way to remove it and who can do it?
Um, So some primary care physicians are willing to do it. Some walk-in clinics are willing to do it. Ear, nose, and throat offices are certainly able to do it. Audiologists, in a lot of cases, can do it. We do it in our office. We have it's got sort of a cheesy name, but it's called the irrigator, and we irrigate your ear. I did not come up with that name, so it wasn't me that came up with the cheesy name. But it works incredibly well, so we can do it in our office. But all that being said, I've seen a whole lot of people think that they have their ears clogged up and that's their problem, and then they come in and we have to tell them, no, your ears are actually quite clear. That's not really the problem. So, there again, we need somebody looking in your ears and we need somebody testing your hearing, and we need to just sort of, look at the entire thing from beginning to end, really.
Can syringing damage the eardrum?
Potentially, if the pressure's high enough. I mean, I will say the over-the-counter stuff is generally not a problem. Um, you have to be a little bit careful though. You don't want to use very cold water because you can make yourself dizzy. So it's best to use water that is roughly 98.6 degrees. Um, um, and also very warm water can make yourself dizzy too. So really, the water ideally will be at, you know, 98.6 degrees. Um, but yeah, generally it's safe. I mean, that stuff is sold over the counter, and over the counter stuff is often kind of harmless. I guess one thing I would say in terms of preventative maintenance, um, I find it's kind of hard for people to do the syringe thing themselves. You can do preventative maintenance though, which is use over-the-counter ear drops on a fairly regular basis, and so that will keep the wax less likely to get impacted.
Are there any programs that help with the cost of hearing aids?
Lots. For one thing, we are fine. I mean, if I think about the course of my career, when I first got into audiology, I mean, we almost never saw anybody that had insurance that helped with hearing aids. And now at this point, Medicare still doesn't help with hearing aids, but the Medicare Advantage plans help with hearing aids. Often non-Medicare primary insurances, that people get through their employer or something like that, that will often have some sort of hearing aid benefit. So, if I think of the big picture, I don't have numbers to back this up, but I have no doubt in my mind there is a much larger percentage of people that have some sort of insurance benefit compared to before. So that's a good thing. Um, Almost every audiology private practice that I'm aware of offers payment plans that are no interest or interest, and you can get the monthly obligation down pretty low. But also, you'll read articles about hearing aids costing, $8,000 or $6,000, or even, some statistics say the national average is about $4,800 for a pair. Um, that's all true, but there are much less expensive options that will still help you. Now, are they as good as the ones that are $6,000, $6,500 for a pair? No. But in a lot of situations, listening situations, they are just as good. And, not to keep, hammering away at something, but there's where a good audiologist is helpful because they can help you figure out what's the right technology for you. We can't help you with your budget so much, but because that's your information and we don't want to get nosy. But we can definitely help you figure out, all right, well, for this listening situation and this listening situation, this is the best level of technology. And for this one and this one, that's the best level of technology. So, what's the right compromise between these situations and your budget? And we help you figure out what's the best thing for you. Like one analogy I make all the time is yet another one. If you live in Florida, it does not make sense to spend extra money on snow tires, right? And so let's say you're somebody who leads a relatively quiet life, it doesn't make sense to spend extra money on hearing aids that are really good with competing noise if your life is fairly quiet. So um, those are some of the things that an audiologist can kind of help out with. And yes, hearing aids are expensive, but I guess I would say there are more options now. There are cheaper options. There's insurance benefits, and while I haven't done a cost benefit analysis, I would sort of wager that finding a way to improve your hearing is less costly than the ramifications of not doing something about your hearing. And I realize that's easy for me to say, but it's something to consider.
I'm actually glad you mentioned that because we have someone here saying that they rank their decision to have hearing aids to be one of the top 3 decisions they've made in their life. It does for hearing what glasses do for your eyes, and I think that's great to share.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredibly rare that a patient will say to us, "Oh yeah, I'm hearing much better now, but I think I'm going to wait."
Mm.
I mean, we hear all day, every day, "Oh, I wish I'd done this sooner. I wish I had done this sooner." So when you're hearing that all day, every day, you begin to think, people need to do this sooner, you know? Um, I mean, look, when people come in and they say, I'm having some troubles, and we test their hearing and we find out it's actually normal, and it may be that they're just in some tough acoustic environments, that's wonderful news for us to give. So, if you're on the fence as to whether your hearing is normal or not, just go get it checked. I would prefer to give good news.
Well, I see still a lot of questions, and we do have a few more minutes, but obviously we need to have Dr. Goyne back because you're asking wonderful questions. He's giving wonderful answers. So I apologize if we don't get to you, as we really are trying. Okay, here's one. My ears are affected by the compression built up in the plane engine when it's landing. What can I do to help this?
Good question. That is really more. Actually, what's happening is the air pressure inside and outside of your head is not equal. So, what you need to do is try and equalize it. And the ways to do that, I mean, there's all sorts of tips and tricks. One thing is, maybe half an hour before you take off, use some sort of, believe it or not, nasal spray that will keep your head less congested. And you may not even feel congested, but anything you can do to keep your sinuses and nasal passages clear, believe it or not, trust me, I could go into more detail, but we're running short on time, but just trust me, keeping your head uncongested will mean the air pressure won't affect your hearing quite as much. Um, I've got a great funny story about one of my daughters in an occasion like that, but maybe I'll save that for my other talk. What else was I going to mention? Chewing gum or just chewing anything, kind of, believe it or not, it works the jaw, which works the sinuses, which helps with the air pressure a little bit. But really the biggest thing is whatever you can do to keep your head clear of congestion and those nasal passages wide open, believe it or not, is going to help. The other thing is you can do the Valsalva maneuver, which, if any of you know what that is basically hold your nose and sort of hold your nose closed, hold your mouth closed, and sort of blow. It's kind of weird, but that's called the Valsalva maneuver, and that will help with the air pressure a little bit too.
I'm going to do 2 more here. One person asks, if my hearing is clearly worse in one ear, but an audio test does not show any problems, what would be your advice?
Could be an auditory processing disorder. It could be that the brain isn't doing a great job of processing sound from that side. I'd be curious to see the hearing test. Sometimes there's subtleties in there that make me say, oh, you know what, there's actually some hearing issues here on the right side. But it also could be the auditory processing. And so I think I would seek out an audiologist who does auditory processing. There aren't a lot of those. I'm sort of one of the few, but because it's a little bit more complicated. But that is one thing that kind of comes to mind. Without seeing the hearing test, it's a little hard for me to say for sure. So yet another question with depends, but those are the thoughts that come to mind.
And our last one that we'll have time for, any recommendations on foods or beverages to decrease tinnitus, and why is tinnitus worse when a storm is brewing?
Oh, interesting question. In terms of diet, yeah, there's a bunch of things. Reduce salt intake. And you may say, oh, I don't put salt on my food. Okay, but look at what's in your food already. There's probably a bunch of salt in there. So reduce salt intake, which again is good for your overall health, right? Reduce sugar in your diet. And again, you may say, well, I don't eat a lot of sweets. But look at the sugar that's in a lot of food. It's just in there. So cut down on that. Caffeine, cut down on that. In terms of the research on alcohol, that seems to show that maybe one glass of wine helps, but probably the second, third, and fourth glass of wine don't help, particularly the next morning. So the jury's out on that one a little bit. And then in terms of why it might be worse when it's storming, two things come to mind. One is changes in air pressure. Your eardrums might be a little tight, and therefore it creates just a little bit more hearing loss temporarily, which makes the ringing seem a little bit louder. That could be it. Or anxiety and stress contribute to your perception of tinnitus as well. And so, if you're somebody who, gets a little uptight when the thunder and lightning is really banging around out there, that could be another reason. Or if it's going on in the middle of the night and it's affecting your sleep, and then you're fatigued and you might perceive the tinnitus a little bit more. Generally speaking, though, again, things don't really ramp up how loud it is. It's really how much people are paying attention to it. And so anything you can do to make the world less quiet, not excessively loud, just less quiet, that's going to make the tinnitus less noticeable.
Well, we appreciate these were great questions. I know there were more, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but that just means we'll have Dr. Goyne back because we enjoyed you, and this was a really interactive presentation. So I'd obviously like to thank you, Dr. Goyne, and to everyone who attended today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a quick 5-question survey. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve in the future as we bring you more Vigor Wellness webinars. Tomorrow, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. You can view the webinar again and share it with others. This email will also provide you a link to learn more about and register for our upcoming wellness webinars. You can find recordings of our past wellness webinars on the Friends Life Care website. Finally, I'd like to let you know about our upcoming Vigor programming. We continue our 6-week Tai Chi series on Tuesdays at 11. And our next Vigor Wellness webinar, Savvy Travel, will be held on September 14th at 2 p.m. So thank you again, Dr. Goyne. Thank you all for being here and for your fabulous questions. And have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.